Hi guys, my name's Goffy and in today's video I want to talk about Fujifilm zoom lenses and one in particular. I think if you're looking at doing some wildlife photography with your Fujifilm camera, there's probably three lenses that you consider. First of all, you've got the 70-300mm. This is the lens that I own, absolutely love it because it is small and compact. You've then got the 100-400mm, which is an awful lot bigger than that previous lens, but it's probably a little bit more professional grade, and that 100-400mm focal range is a pretty good range to cover. And then finally, you've got the newest lens to this kind of lineup, the 150-600mm Fujifilm lens, in case 400mm just wasn't enough for you. And it's that final lens that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, for full disclosure, Fujifilm have sent me this lens to review. I reached out to them because I was going on a trip where I suspected my 70-300 might not serve me well. I have no obligations in terms of what I'm allowed to say. All thoughts and views are my own, but I wanted to get out there that I don't actually own this lens right now, but I'll tell you at the end of the video whether or not I'm going to buy it. Now, in terms of specs then, let's start with the obvious. This is a 150-600mm lens. That is a pretty ridiculous range that it covers. Now, in terms of full frame equivalent, we're talking like 920mm here, so it's pretty extreme. The lens is quite heavy. It comes in at 1.6 kilograms, which for a Fuji lens is definitely on the heavy side. For a wildlife lens, you know what, it's not actually that bad, not for the kind of range that it covers. Now, a little bit of that weight has been saved by the fact that this is a reasonably slow lens. This lens goes from f5.6 at the wide end up to f8 at the far end. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about how that affects what you can use this lens for later in the video. Now, inside the lens we have got 24 elements in 17 groups, and there's a fair amount of exotic glass in here as well, which probably makes up some of the price. In terms of the barrel of the lens, there are a few switches here. We've got a focus preset button, we've got a focus selector, an aperture mode selector, a focus range selector, and then down the end of the barrel we have these four focus control buttons, each at 90 degrees round the lens. The lens also comes packaged with a few things. You get a lens hood. It took me a little while to work out what the cutout was for, but I'm pretty sure it's so you can change if you've got like a polarizer filter whilst it's attached to the lens. You also get a shoulder strap with a bag as well, and the lens itself comes already mounted with the tripod monopod mount on it. This tripod monopod mount can be moved wherever you want it. There's little markers on the lens that show you clearly where the 90-degree angles are. So if you've got a lens like this and you've been given it for 2 weeks, what do you go and do? Now, for me, there's been a trip that I've wanted to do for years, and I finally went and done it. I went to shoot puffins at Bempton Cliffs. Now, this is something that genuinely I've wanted to do for years, but I always suspected that my 70-300mm might not give me the range I needed, as I was pretty aware that these puffins were going to be quite far away. Now, I was super excited to get there. We woke up at like 4 AM, we drove all the way to the north of England, got there for like 10 AM and went out. Now, I was super stoked because of the trip and because I had this awesome new lens to try out. Now, I'd also packed my Peak Design tripod because I suspected that I was going to use the tripod 100% of the time. Turns out, not a single photo or video that you're going to see in this entire YouTube video was taken with a tripod. I ended up just using the built-in IBIS of the XH2S along with the optical stabilization built into the zoom lens, and to be honest with you, I found it to be more than good enough. Now, just walking from the car to the cliff face, something really stood out. This is a pretty hefty lens. It weighs 1.6 kilograms, but the bigger issue for me was the fact that the lens doesn't fit inside my camera bag. So for the whole trip, I was carrying the lens separately to my camera bag, which was a little bit annoying. The other thing that stood out with a little bit of pre-testing the day before is the fact that this lens looks super professional. Now, that might be a good thing, but for me, it's actually not all that great. Now, shooting in some woodland behind my house, for the first time ever, I got asked what I was doing. Now, I typically shoot here with my 70-300mm all the time. No one's ever asked me a thing, but walking around with this great big white lens on the front of my camera was the first time that somebody actually said to me, "What is it you're doing here?" So I think looking professional is a good thing, but in some cases it might not be, so just consider where it is you plan on using this lens. It's not so easy to blend in when you've got a great big white lens on the front of your camera. So having walked from the car to the cliff face and connecting the lens to my camera, the next thing that I noticed was how windy it was and how bad the hood is in terms of catching the wind. I was doing a lot of hand holding, and every time a big gust of wind came past, if I was holding my camera at an angle that kind of went against the wind, I felt like I had to fight it a little bit, especially when you're trying to hand hold at 600mm. And then most importantly, we saw the puffins. And honestly, it made me so happy to finally get a photo of a puffin. It made the whole trip, the early get up, totally worth it. And if I've not shown you enough puffin images over on Instagram, anyway, here's some more throughout this YouTube video. So then let's talk performance, and I think we'll kick this off with autofocus. Conscious that I'm using the XH2S, so maybe I'm experiencing like best case scenario, but I found it to be really good, especially bird autofocus. Quite often it would lock onto their eyes as well. Now I did for a little while think that maybe my images were coming out slightly out of focus, but I realised quite early on what was happening was the fact that I was hand holding a 600mm lens and my camera default shutter speed was set to 250th. So even at 250th, ever so slight movements were being picked up that I thought initially was the camera missing focus, but it wasn't. It was me just not using a quick enough shutter speed. I found that 750th of a second was that kind of area where at 600mm handheld, I was getting like pin sharp shots. Now another thing that really helps with autofocus is making use of the focus limiter. Now the lens has a close focusing distance of 2.4 meters and the default on that focus limiter switch is 5 meters to infinity. Now you might think, well, switching that on, you're not really cutting out much, you're only cutting out like 2.4 meters to 5, but that seems to be an awful lot of the focus throw within the lens, and just cutting that a bit off completely really helps this lens focus. And talking about that 2.4 meter close focusing distance, at 600mm you can still get pretty close. Here's an image of a dragonfly shot pretty close to that 2.4 meter limit, and it pretty much fills the frame. And then next up, we really need to talk about stabilization, because like I said, I didn't use a tripod once. Throughout all of the trips that I did with this lens, whilst I had it, I just never used tripod. I absolutely hate tripods, but the stabilization is surprisingly good. All of the video footage you're seeing is me hand holding predominantly at 600mm. So if you've been watching this thinking these shots look quite good, then that's a pretty good sign of how good the stability is. I didn't stand still and see what the slowest shutter speed I could shoot with. Probably should have done, but I do think typically with a wildlife lens, you're going to be setting your shutter speed based on your subject rather than what the kind of environment looks like. And I think this leads us nicely on to what for many people is going to be the Achilles heel of this lens, and that's the fact that it's pretty slow. f5.6 to f8, at all focal lengths, you've not really got speed on your side. Now I think from a background separation point of view, you're absolutely fine. 600mm and f8 I don't think is going to be causing anybody any issues there. I think the real downside is if you're shooting a handheld and you're at f8 and you're at 600mm and the light's not so great, you're going to have to make a compromise somewhere, and I think for many people that's going to mean that you're going to have to up your ISO a little bit. And I found myself quite often shooting at pretty high ISOs without really realising. And I do think as good as Fujifilm cameras have got, full frame cameras when it comes to low light still are better than Fuji cameras. I found myself, especially with some of these duck images on our trip to Richmond Park, accidentally leaning into high ISOs without really realising the fact I was doing it. These images, to me, still look good, but I don't think they maybe have that kind of professional look to some of them that maybe I'd be looking for. And then lastly, I guess, what is this camera like when it comes to optical performance? Now I said earlier that I ended up taking the lens hood off and not really using it, and I didn't see any flaring at all. When it comes to lens sharpness, even at 600mm, I think they look pretty good. I've not really had any issues at all looking at any of the images and thinking, I wish they were sharper. You've seen now 20, 30, 40 images from my trip. Did you once look at them and think, I just wish that image was a little bit sharper? Because I definitely haven't. I didn't shoot any walls, so I can't really go into detail if there was any kind of focal lengths where things started to go wrong. But at the extreme ends of the lens, I found it to be very, very good. But again, I've not really done any scientific tests. All I can see is that I really like my own images. So in conclusion then, if you want a Fujifilm lens with a super long focal length, this is going to be your only option. Now I think if you are in the market for a telephoto lens, these will probably be my considerations. Now if you don't really need 600mm, you might just be better off with the 100 to 400mm. You've got a little bit more speed there, it's still a pretty big chunky lens, but it's still nowhere near as big as this 150 to 600mm is. And if you're still not really sure if you need the 100 to 400mm, definitely give the 70 to 300 a consideration. That lens has a pretty good focal length. 300mm, although half of 600, is still pretty impressive, and that is a lens that easily fits into a small camera bag. Now I said at the start of this video I was going to let you know if I'm going to buy this lens or not, and the answer to that question is no. I'm not going to buy this lens, and that's just purely because of the photography that I do. I am not a dedicated wildlife photographer. If I was, this lens makes an awful lot of sense, but the reality is this is something that I only do maybe once, twice a year, And in that case, I'm probably better off just hiring it on the days that I need it, rather than going and spending the £1,800 that I think it costs. If you are a dedicated wildlife shooter, then you'll probably know that if this is the lens for you, and it might be the only option because of all that length that it gives you. Another thing to consider as well is that most of the Fujifilm lenses, these telephotos, do accept the extenders. You're going to lose a little bit of speed, but at the same time, that is another way of getting that kind of like extra length. The 150-600mm also accepts the two extenders as well, so you could get some absolutely bonkers focal lengths, but at some pretty slow speeds. So for me personally then, I'm going to be sticking with my 70-300mm. I did a video on it a while back, and if you want to check that out, you can see that here. But if you've enjoyed this video, guys, please do not forget to like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.